Our next speaker is going to touch on equipping caregivers within the Christian community with an understanding of issues influencing suicides to facilitate compassionate post-vention care of suicide bereaved, and Pastor Astrid Staley from the Global Ministry Melbourne School of Theology. Welcome.
Good morning. On July 7th, 2010, I received a phone call from the Queensland Police informing me that my 22-year-old daughter Jade, after suffering 8 months of severe postnatal depression, took her life and the life of her 8-month-old son. As you can appreciate, navigating forward from such an event exposed me to a host of emotions and trauma that I had never previously anticipated or even thought were possible to go through. I am an ordained Christian minister in a Pentecostal church, and I've worked as a Bible college lecturer and educator of fellow Christian ministers for the last 7 years in a Bible college. And as I reflect backwards on my time as a lecturer and in my own theological training, I can honestly say that throughout that time in my own training and in training other Christian leaders for their chosen vocation, I had never come across any particular course that could prepare me for dealing with such a tragedy within a Christian community. And so I found this quite challenging. I had my own assumptions on the subject from a Christian perspective, and when my assumptions were challenged through the fire of life's experience, they were shown to be wanting. These were my main 4 assumptions. The first assumption was that Christians are well able to dialogue on this particular subject of suicide. My second assumption was that Christian community is well capable and well placed to cope with such a tragedy when it occurs in their midst. My third assumption was that pastors don't experience suicide in their family. And my final assumption was that there would be plentiful support in the event of such a tragedy. Unfortunately, the weeks and the months and the days that followed showed that there was quite a significant fissure in the way the Christian community dealt with a suicide in their midst, and how they were able to offer post-vention support for someone like myself. My lived experience through this time became the subject and the impetus for undertaking a doctorate in this arena. And my doctorate at Melbourne School of Theology embraces the subject of how do we do post-vention care of the suicide bereaved, particularly looking at the theological responses and pastoral responses through the gathering of qualitative and quantitative data within the Christian community. The intended outcome of this research is to build upon the current knowledge and practices within the Christian community in post-vention care of the bereaved, and alongside with that, challenging some of the ingrained legacies upon our thinking towards the Suicide Act, so that we might better facilitate a more holistic care and approach towards suicide bereaved. I see this as extremely critical within the Christian movement. Australian statistics tell us that every 3.5 hours, someone ends their life. Every 8 minutes, a person attempts to end their life. And 86 people every day self-harm and require hospitalisation. And aside from the intergenerational impact, for every one suicide, and I state the statistics relating to the emotional proximity of the person, of the bereaved to the suicide, 15 to 30 people are impacted by such a tragedy. This is quite significant. So that really suggests, more likely than not, that a Christian minister will be faced with someone like myself through the course of their ministry life. And so that is why this particular undertaking of the study is so essential, and to really address some of these ingrained legacies upon our thinking and approaches to the Suicide Act. When we review the literature, both historical and religious literature, we see that both religion and the secular world have been bedfellows in imposing a significant level of stigma upon the Suicide Act. Consequently, this has influenced the way we have approached these issues over the century. Whilst there is still a noticeable level of stigma within society today, with the advent of a greater understanding within the various fields of research, the secular world has provided innovation in its approach to suicide prevention and postvention. From where I sit as a pastor and as a caregiver myself, I see that the Christian world is lagging behind in this area. I don't say that as a criticism, because we are all on a journey, and some of us are geared to facilitate that journey. What I see is having hamstrung the Christian community in their ability to engage in dialogue and adequately cope with a tragedy of this nature in their midst, and look after someone myself, providing appropriate postvention support, is their reluctance to recalibrate entrenched theological mindsets towards the Suicide Act and integrate valuable theories from within the secular research, areas such as psychology, social science and mental health, in an endeavour to comprehend the complexity that surrounds such a tragedy, as we've been hearing at this conference this week. Drawing upon the understanding from within various fields of secular endeavour can only serve to equip the Christian community to follow suit in bridging the gaps that currently exist in their thinking and approaches. Conversely, there are also perspectives within the Christian belief system that can further secular understanding to the contributing forces in the life of a suicide. From my pastoral experience and my lived experience, what I have seen and sadly noted is that approaches to suicide prevention and mental illness and depression are often limited to responses such as, you need to read your Bible more, you need to pray more, you need to repent, you need to be a person of greater faith, just speak the right words over your life and it will be okay. You need to rid your life of sin. And whilst these things are not wrong in themselves, these are oversimplified, over-spiritualised approaches to this particular tragedy. And such encounters can only serve to catapult a person with suicidal ideations or self-harmers into a deeper sense of hopelessness, shame, guilt, offering absolutely no comfort or recognition of the reality of life's challenges. The responses evidence little appreciation for the psychological, biological and sociological contributors in the life of the suicide. I really love the words of Stillian and McDowell as they highlight the complexity when they say that suicide behaviour results from a complex interaction of biology, psychology, cognitions and environmental forces. Biology forms the core of who we are, but biology does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a psychological, social, spiritual person who lives in a particular time within a material environment and complex culture. Over-spiritualised responses, oversimplified responses fail to recognise the value of various methods within psychology and how best to integrate them with our theology. Beck and Demarest comment on the value and the limitations of each and why it's so important to be able to take the strengths and weaknesses of both. They make the comment that theology provides us with a wealth of information about the spiritual status of various components of human functioning. Psychology continues its efforts to understand more the mechanisms governing these functions. Coupled with advances in biological science, neuroscience and medicine, Our understanding is more complete now than it has been before, and yet it still must continue to grow. Whilst providing ample information about other components of human functioning, such as motivation, behaviour, emotion and cognition, the Bible does not clearly address in human functioning such as conscience and intelligence. Psychology is here best able to contribute information about how these functions are anchored in genetics and how they develop within a lifespan and the mechanics undergirding them. Theology, on the other hand, enables us to appreciate the implications of these functions from a biblical perspective. I see the importance of sectors within the Christian community to challenge their existing presuppositions and to mature in their appreciation of the value of secular approaches. Otherwise, we will continue to offer oversimplified, over-spiritualised approaches in suicide prevention. I find myself at this particular juncture as a pastor and educator and researcher, someone who has gone through lived experience in this area, to challenge these areas and to grow the Christian community in their understanding and in their thinking of these different aspects and the different challenges that are involved in suicide, so that we might be better positioned and able to contribute to the collective impact of suicide prevention and postvention. And I really liked what our first speaker said this morning as she opened up and said how intricately involved is postvention with prevention. And that is just so critical to understanding the importance of good postvention care. One of the chosen means that I have taken to do this and to address these issues within the Christian community, along with my doctoral studies, I have recently just published a book that is a handbook that is accompanied by workshops, and the book is entitled Pastor's Handbook, Complete Guide to Suicide Ministry, Theology and Practice, Entering the World of the Suicide and the Bereaved. And this particular book brings together the latest research in suicide, statistics and understandings within the areas of social science, the areas of biology, the areas of psychology, those that we can safely integrate within our biblical perspectives. The workshops that I host, and I'm looking to host because it's only just been launched, will contribute to the qualitative and quantitative data within my thesis. A pre-seminar survey, which is a self-contemplating survey that has questions that is based on the outcomes and the objectives of the workshop. And this is given to the participants in order to assess where they are in their ability and in their confidence and skill in managing postvention. The outcomes of these comparisons are then brought down into percentages to demonstrate the participants' present knowledge and skill in postvention care, the participants' subjective evaluation of knowledge of skills gained following the seminar, and thirdly, the convergence and divergence between the data gathered from questionnaires and in-depth interviews where present. So that will then be compared to the interviews that will take place between people who would like to volunteer from within these workshops, who are perhaps at some time have been involved in postvention care. So that I would be looking at chaplains, I would be looking at pastors, youth workers, anyone who falls into that category who would like to then participate in a semi-structured, in-depth interview. These subjects and these workshops take place within Australia, in any state in Australia, as well as Tasmania and New Zealand. The final artefact that I hope that will emerge after these study has been completed is a unit of study that will be prepared for those who go through Pentecostal and evangelical training as ministers. But this would not be an optional extra, but almost an important pathway to their actual selected studies, whatever that may be. I see that as Christian caregivers are equipped with an underpinning knowledge of the key issues prevalent in the life of a suicide and the unique challenges to someone who is bereaved of suicide, they are then well able and better able to minister to the bereaved. In such an event, the minister and the bereaved are brought together in a form of therapeutic encounter which enables the caregiver to offer something of lasting value to the bereaved in their remaking of life out of trauma. Whether or not we can come into complete agreement is not the issue, so that as this is absolutely not possible from a Christian perspective, as some of the undergirding premises of psychology are incongruent with biblical perspectives. However, an adversarial position motivated by distrust and fear further cripples any potential in this area. We need to be prepared and willing to confront entrenched mindsets and take on board from secular approaches and integrate that which will better position us to contribute to the collective impact of suicide prevention and post-vention care. In addition to that, I also have the passion upon myself to minister to and to speak to schools, both secular and Christian, on thriving and not just surviving. It's really important that we have this kind of message brought out to our young teens and young adults as they are navigating their way through life, and also the many challenges that are confronting them in their growing years. Thank you. Any questions? Hope I've got some answers.
Thank you for that. I personally have been through this. My wife and I, our family belonged to a large rural Pentecostal church, and it was a huge issue. Said before, one or the other, we went through a period where my wife had 13 overdoses in an 18-month period. After that first one, she was still in hospital. She came home for the weekend. She wanted to go to church. She got grabbed by 5 of the women leaders and told she succeeded, she was going to help. And that is, things like that are the reason why we no longer belong to the church. The other aspect that's an issue is that we have the church saying we shouldn't be going to public mental health services. The public mental health service is saying, oh, get out of the church. So there needs to be an understanding that way as well. But for me, as you're saying, the church learning to be an appropriate caregiver, because there is a big difference between possession, oppression and depression. And that was one of our biggest issues, was because I couldn't fix it, it had to be demonic.
Yes.
And I said to them, well, you know, you've tried to cast this out, it hasn't gone. The Word of God says if it's demonic, it's got to go.
Yes.
So what does that tell you?
Yes.
And we got virtually outcast. So
it's
a big issue.
I'm really sorry to hear that you've had that experience, and I would state from my own pastoral experience and for people who have come to me for pastoral assistance that you are certainly not alone.
Okay, over here.
I want to encourage you in what you're doing for a similar reason. Over 4 years ago, my mother took her life. She was a good Catholic. Her funeral, after the funeral, I walked out of that church and I never darkened the door again, because the message I got was not only is she dead, but she's damned. She's gone to hell. And there was no comfort whatsoever. And it's had a huge impact on my life. Sad about that particular aspect, because I haven't missed it. And I no longer call myself a Christian or anything, because and so this is 40 years later. I'm really glad that you're finally doing something about this
Can I just make a comment just on that comment there? We have. There's no actual, and I just want to speak to this one thing while I've got you here. There is no biblical statement that says a suicide goes to hell. This is the invention of human beings. And the unfortunate problem is, and even as a Bible college lecturer, I have stood in my classes and students have said to me that the Bible says so. Well, I want to tell you that the Bible doesn't say anything about suicides. It records suicides but makes no condemnation either way. So I just want to encourage you that whilst I appreciate that people here have come from a church background that have been very, very hurt by the stupidity of human beings, we are just human beings. And human beings are also on a journey of learning. And I just encourage you to don't let that affect your relationship with God and not to allow yourself to become bitter, but to become better.
Stan at the back.
Thank you. I'd like to just make a couple of comments. The first one is, historically, I agree with you that theology and Christian belief is responsible for part of the stigma that is occurring around mental health and suicide. In terms of an observation, I note that there has been positive statements from Christian faith, interdenominational statements, and also across faith around the issue of organ donation. This has received some publicity in the last 12 months. My question is twofold. Is there potential for different denominations within the Christian faith to have dialogue around suicide in a theological sense? And secondly, is there potential for organisations like Suicide Prevention Australia to encourage such dialogue?
Yes, on both counts. I see that definitely there is a shift, as you say. Definitely, the tide is turning, but when you try and change the trajectory of a large ship, it doesn't happen overnight. I definitely see that there is a softening and a more biblical approach, if you like, to the discussion on suicide, as it should be.
And we've got plenty of time, but there's a lot of people with hands up, so we'll go to the back first.
Hi, Astrid. Thank you for your talk. Just a question. Look, we've heard some questions. We've heard an example of a Pentecostal situation, a Catholic situation over here. In your talk, you often talked about the Christian community, but I'm wondering whether you have anything to say about what you're seeing in terms of the various variations within the Christian community. You know, different denominations, liberal Christians, Pentecostal Christians, evangelical Christians. Is there any particular differences that you're seeing in their response to this, block of suicide?
Yes, that's a good question. My research is very much confined to evangelicals and Pentecostals, but even with Catholicism and within other liberals and more conservative approaches, there's always varying opinions within each. It's very fragmented, but more often than not, I see more of a demonisation thereof of the Suicide Act, and I certainly have to make it clear that I don't endorse suicide in any way, so from a Christian perspective, but I understand the complexity of the issues that are involved in suicide.
So Alan, we'll go Alan first, and then we'll go here and then here.
I congratulate you on the presentation.
Thank you.
I think the tide is churning, but very slowly,
Yes.
unfortunately. I don't know how many times I've had to conduct a funeral for someone whose families have bereaved because the church would not allow a funeral
Yes.
to take place. It's so sad, but I think things, as I say, are slowly changing. One other thing, I just wondering how can we obtain that book of yours?
At this stage, it is presented in conjunction with my workshops.
Yeah.
So the best thing to do would be probably to, there's my email address. So at this present time, and because I'm undertaking these doctoral studies and these data forms the hub of my research, it is limited to the workshops.
People might also be waiting for YouTube, because we're so lazy now, we wait for YouTube. Over here.
Ashton, thank you very much for your talk. How do you respond to the issue of where there are many groups in society who experience high rates of suicide,
Yes,
in particular in the gay and lesbian community,
yes,
and the evidence is fairly clear that discrimination and stigma contributes to the high rates of mental illness and high rates of suicide, when that discrimination and the beliefs around homosexuality are actually fundamental to some people's Christian faith. For example, involved in marriage equality debate in Tasmania.
Yes.
And it's proven that marriage equality legislation, I work for the Mental Health Council, the reason we took this on board is because the evidence is abundantly clear that marriage equality reduces rates of mental illness. We suspect reduces rates of suicide in that community as well. But those opposed to marriage equality have cited the higher rates of mental illness and higher rates of suicide as evidence as something being wrong with same-sex attracted people, rather than it's actually evidence of their discrimination against. Now, the Bible is fairly clear in terms of condemning homosexuality. So, how do you respond to that issue in terms of causing stigma and discrimination that leads to high rates of suicide and mental illness?
Thank you for the question. It's quite a detailed question, and I might have to hold a seminar just to answer your question. If I could put it in very simplistic terms, which probably won't do it justice, I don't see the issue of homosexuality any different than someone struggling with mental illness. I don't discriminate between a person who is clearly identified as themselves as homosexual. However, I will say this, and this is where I find the secular research will also become very biased and oversimplified. To turn and say that it is because a person's sexual orientation is what causes them to, or the stigma that's associated with that causes them to commit suicide, I think is way too oversimplistic. And it's the same kind of thing that you get from the Christian community that says a person who commits suicide, regardless of what their undercurrent status is because they haven't got enough faith. Your comment, I would see, is simplistic in the same sense as I find the Christian approach to someone, regardless of who they are, as equally simplistic if it just boils down to that they didn't pray enough. So, it's probably a little bit beyond our point to discuss here, but I think that statement is oversimplistic. I think there's many more when we go to the issues. But I will stop there if you don't mind, because I think I think personally that's a study all on itself, and I haven't drawn into a very specific people population study. I'm drawing upon pastoral responses.
It's a great research question for an ARC.
Yes.
The academics are in the room.
Yes.
Michael, over to you.
You've partly just answered my question. The gentleman before has just asked that question.
Yes.
I also just wanted to ask you, thank you by the way for the terrific presentation.
Thank
I think you've opened up an incredibly important area by putting this presentation on the program.
Thank you.
Look, I just wanted to ask, is there anything actually out there in terms of guidelines in other parts of the world, UK, US, about how religious leaders ought to be conducting funerals, given this is such an important issue? Is there? I mean, I know that this is in the melting pot as we speak, but is there any guidance?
That's a really good question, and in my studies I actually did look at the kind of resources that are available to pastors and ministers and those who do conduct funerals and are involved in some sort of pastoral care. And in the area of suicide, it is quite minimal, to be honest with you. A lot of it is left up to the person themselves and their own position on suicide. The responses vary within the literature that I have been able to access and the resources available to Christian caregivers and leaders, and that is to not to mention the suicide at all within a service, which I don't think is helpful and only contributes to the shame that now the bereaved must carry, because it's all been too shameful to even mention the name. The suggestion that it could cause others with suicidal ideations present to then go out and act upon those ideations is also unsubstantiated. And if anything, it provides a great opportunity to actually minister to everybody who's there and openly acknowledge and take away that stigma of silence that has dogged this particular word for so many centuries.
Yeah, I've been involved in two funerals in the last 12 months of people who've had faith, convictions, and
Yes.
one of whom was a mental health professional, and one where the priest presiding adopted exactly that attitude that the whole thing was invisible and hadn't happened.
Yes.
The second where there's a reference to the weakness of our departed brother, and the mental health professionals in attendance referred to the, being bewildered by the choice that he'd made. So, I mean,
Yes.
we've got a huge distance to go.
And that comes down to educating.
Yeah.
Because when these people, ministers like myself, go through seminary training, there is nothing that equips us to speak to the situation, or to even, what do you do at a funeral? What do you do when someone confronts you with suicidal ideations? How do you deal with that from a pastoral response? So
Anyway,
it is education, and I think at the top level that's where we need to move.
Now, ironically enough, we don't have any more time, but we do have two people that do have questions. So we'll take one at the back on table 25. You had your hand up.
I just wanted to comment that I am a part of a church that does address mental health issues.
Wonderful.
And we have, over the last 20 years, had several people who have suicided.
Mhm.
And we have, for example, in the funerals, addressed the issue around suicide and supported the families and the people. They were both young people, and supported the youth group and the families around the issue of suicide.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and it is growing.
So in true Q&A fashion, we'll take that as a comment.
Yes.
Now, do you have a question, or is
It's a
it...
question. Are there any differences between Christian and non-Christian caregivers from the perspective we just gave?
Could you just repeat that?
Are there any differences between Christian and non-Christian caregivers from the perspective we just gave?
Christian and non-Christian caregivers. Well, I'm sure there would be. My particular area of investigation is within Christian caregivers. Clearly, when you assess non-Christian literature, there's obviously more emphasis on the secular perspective, which often leaves out the spiritual perspective. And as that comment I read, that we are complex beings that must speak not only to the psychological, social, but also to the spiritual perspective. So there's still a balance that needs to be brought into the non-Christian sector as well as the Christian sector. We're all on a journey of learning, and I think the most important question is, are we open to learning?
One more.
Can I just say, look, Stan posed a question earlier about SPA's responsibility in relation to this area. I don't know, we haven't discussed this as a board, but it seems to me that this is a pretty important area, and I just wonder, there's been some really good questions that have come from the floor today, and I just wondered if anyone is particularly interested in furthering this agenda.
Absolutely.
It might be worth self-identifying. We can take a note of that. Maybe Astrid, you'd be interested in helping us around this. I'm not saying we're going to do this body of work, so I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying there's people here now, rather than walk away, could you actually, if you wish, identify yourself as someone who'd be interested in at least commentating on something coming up about this, if we got a document up of some sort.
And I also have some handouts if you'd like to take a hold of them, and you can contact me on my email address there, and that will certainly communicate that way as well.
So we'll take Michael as a comment. Thank you very much, Astrid.
Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful.